Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back, to a place where the air hangs thick with dust, the sun bakes your skin, and the only soundtrack is the lowing of 1,000 cattle and the creak of worn leather. You're there, right now, astride a sturdy, tired horse, squinting into the endless horizon. The smell of sweat and horse flesh is a constant companion, mingling with the faint, acrid scent of campfire smoke. Your muscles ache in places you didn't even know existed, and your hat is perpetually caked with the fine, powdery soil of the open range. This isn't the movie version, bathed in golden light with perfectly coiffed heroes. This is the gritty, often brutal, reality of the American cowboy. You're about to discover how they didn't just survive the endless miles, the sticky-fingered bandits, and food that could generously be called nutritional, but how they forged a legend out of sheer, unadulterated stubbornness. And honestly, you probably wouldn't last a week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're already feeling it, aren't you? That slight sway as your horse walks, the rhythmic creak of the saddle, a sound that will become as familiar as your own heartbeat over the coming weeks. This isn't a leisure ride. This is your office, your living room, your entire world for months on end. Your day begins long before the sun even thinks about peeking over the horizon, often roused by the gruff call of the cook or the aroma of brewing coffee which, trust me, is more about caffeine delivery than flavor. You stumble out of your bedroll, which probably feels more like a lumpy burrito than a cozy cocoon, and the chill morning air bites at your face. There's no hitting snooze here, no leisurely stretch. The cattle, a living, breathing river of beef, are already stirring, and they won't wait for you to feel fully awake. Your first task, before you even think about breakfast, is to retrieve your horse from the night herd, a detail often overlooked in the romanticized tales. Imagine trying to spot your specific mount among hundreds, sometimes thousands, of horses, all looking remarkably similar in the pre-dawn gloom. It's like trying to find your specific black sock in a pile of other black socks, except these socks can kick you. Once you've caught your horse, often with a lariat thrown with practiced ease, you saddle up. This isn't a quick cinch and go. Your saddle is your most prized possession, a custom-fitted piece of gear that costs a fortune and is meticulously cared for. It has to be, because it's the only thing separating your posterior from literal agony for 15 hours a day. Then comes breakfast. If you're lucky, it's Flapjack's thick, often tough pancakes, cooked over an open fire, usually slathered with molasses. More often, it's simply coffee and bacon, or perhaps some cold beans left over from the night before. This isn't a meal to savor, it's fuel. You eat quickly, standing or squatting, your senses already attuned to the subtle shifts in the herd. The sun is now a fiery orb on the horizon, painting the sky in oranges and purples, but you barely notice. Your focus is already on the vast, lowing mass of cattle, your charges for the day. Your job for the next 10 to 15 hours is surprisingly simple in concept, yet brutally complex in execution. Keep the cattle moving forward in the right direction and prevent them from scattering. Simple, right? Except these aren't well-behaved pets. They're thousands of half-wild animals with a collective mind of their own, prone to spooking at the slightest sound or just deciding, en masse, that this particular patch of grass is simply too delicious to leave. You become an extension of your horse, riding the flanks of the herd, nudging stragglers, cutting off would-be escapees. The dust, a constant companion, rises in plumes, coating your clothes, your hair settling in your lungs. You learn to breathe shallowly, to squint through the haze, to rely on instinct and the subtle cues of the herd. This relentless, plodding pace is the very essence of the cattle drive, a slow, inexorable crawl across vast, often featureless landscapes. Historians still argue whether the romantic image of the lone cowboy truly captured the communal effort required, but one thing is certain. the work was never-ending. One quirky tidbit often forgotten is the sheer monotony. Imagine seeing the same view, day after day, week after week. No Netflix, no podcasts, just the endless horizon and the rhythmic thud of hooves. Cowboys would often sing to the cattle, not just for their own entertainment, but to soothe the herd, to keep them calm and moving. Sometimes they'd even tell stories, their voices carrying over the lowing, creating a strange, auditory tapestry against the vast silence. It was a subtle, almost spiritual connection, a way of humanizing the relentless mechanical process of moving thousands of animals. You're still there, aren't you? That persistent ache in your lower back, the subtle chafing where your jeans meet the saddle. It's not just in the movies where cowboys look a bit bow-legged. That's a direct consequence of spending most of your waking hours astride a horse. Your legs, perpetually bent at the knee, develop a muscle memory for that specific angle, and walking on solid ground can feel foreign, almost wobbly after days or weeks in the saddle. It's like your body forgets how to be entirely vertical. And the saddle itself? Far from the plush, cushioned seats of modern equestrians. These were work tools designed for security and function, not comfort. The horn, the cantle, the stirrups, every part was there for a reason, to keep you attached to a moving animal, often at speed, across uneven terrain. You quickly learn the precise way to sit, to shift your weight, to become one with your mount, because any dissonance translates directly into pain. The saddle sores, oh, the saddle sores. This isn't a topic for polite dinner conversation, but it's a brutal reality of the trail. Imagine friction, dust, sweat, and long hours, all conspiring against your skin. Cowboys developed an almost supernatural tolerance for discomfort, or perhaps, more accurately, an ingenious array of homemade remedies. Lanolin, rendered animal fat, or even just layers of old cloth were used to try and mitigate the inevitable. Some would even strategically cut holes in their breeches, a fashion statement born purely of necessity, to relieve pressure points. It's a testament to their resilience that they didn't just spend their days groaning in agony. Historians still argue whether the invention of specific saddle designs contributed more to the cowboys' endurance than their sheer toughness. But it's clear both played a role. And then there's the horse itself. This isn't your weekend trail ride pony. This is a highly trained, incredibly intelligent working animal. You rely on your horse for everything, for speed, for agility, for endurance. A good cowboy and his horse are an almost symbiotic unit, communicating with subtle shifts of weight, rein pressure, and even unspoken cues. You learn your horse's temperament, its quirks, its strengths, and its weaknesses. Sometimes you'd have a string of horses, cycling through them to prevent any one animal from becoming exhausted. But often, especially on smaller drives, you and your single mount were in it for the long haul. You learn to listen to the rhythm of its breathing, to feel the tension in its muscles, to anticipate its next move. This bond isn't sentimental. It's practical, a matter of survival for both of you. Consider the actual act of riding for hours on end, day after day. It's not just about sitting there. You're constantly scanning the herd, watching for signs of trouble. Is a steer straying? Is there a subtle shift in the wind that might spook the cattle? Are there riders approaching in the distance, friend or foe? Your eyes are perpetually sifting through the visual noise of thousands of animals and endless landscape. Your ears are tuned to the lowing, the creak of leather, the subtle sounds that betray a problem. And all the while, your body is absorbing the constant jolt and sway of the horse, a never-ending, subtle tremor that eventually becomes part of your very being. A quirky tidbit that often goes unmentioned. Cowboys develop a unique way of sleeping in the saddle during long night watches, a sort of half-doze where their bodies would sway with the horse's movement, allowing for brief, precious moments of rest without actually dismounting. It's like a micro-nap for pioneers. Imagine trusting your horse so completely that you can essentially sleepwalk through the night, guided by its instincts and its steady pace. It speaks volumes about the level of integration between man and beast on the trail. You're not just riding the horse. You're with the horse, a shared consciousness navigating the vast darkness under a blanket of stars. You probably won't get that kind of trust from your office chair, no matter how many hours you spend in it. As you nudge your horse forward, falling into the rhythmic plod of the herd, you quickly realize this isn't a solo adventure. While the image of the lone cowboy is iconic, the reality of a successful cattle drive was a meticulously coordinated effort, much like a giant, slow-motion ballet. And at the heart of this organized chaos stood one man, the trail boss. This wasn't a ceremonial title. It was a position of absolute authority, a singular decision-maker whose word was law, and whose experience meant the difference between a successful drive and a catastrophic failure. Imagine the sheer weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He was responsible for the lives of every man in his crew, the safety of thousands of head of cattle, and the success of an enterprise worth a significant sum of money. There were no phones, no GPS, no instant weather forecasts. His decisions were based on years of accumulated wisdom, reading the subtle signs of the land, interpreting the sky for impending storms, knowing where the next water source might be, and understanding the temperament of both his men and his animals. He had to be a master of logistics, a natural leader, and often a shrewd negotiator when dealing with landowners, Native American tribes, or even other trail bosses trying to cut across his path. The trail boss was typically the first one awake and the last one to sleep. He rode point, leading the herd, setting the pace, and constantly scouting ahead for dangers, be they rustlers, stampede triggers, or simply a lack of forage. He had to be an expert horseman, a crack shot, and possess an almost encyclopedic knowledge of the trails, many of which were little more than faint tracks across vast, uncharted territories. His decisions were swift and often brutal in their necessity, because hesitation could mean disaster. If he said cross that swollen river, you crossed it. If he said ride through the night, you rode. There was no room for dissent or democratic process on the open range. It's like being the CEO of a highly unstable, mobile corporation where the product can run away and your employees carry firearms. A common historical fact, often overlooked, is that many trail bosses were surprisingly young men, sometimes barely out of their teens, who had proven their mettle through sheer grit and competence. Experience trumped age on the frontier. They learned by doing, often starting as wranglers or line riders and working their way up. This wasn't a job you applied for with a resume. It was a role you earned through demonstrated ability to survive and lead in one of the harshest environments imaginable. One quirky tidbit about the trail boss's authority: he often acted as judge, jury, and sometimes executioner in disputes among his crew. Minor squabbles were settled with a stern word, but serious infractions, especially those that threatened the drive's success or the safety of others, could result in immediate dismissal, being left stranded miles from civilization or worse. The concept of frontier justice wasn't just a catchy phrase. It was a raw, immediate reality enforced by the man in charge. Historians still argue whether the absolute power wielded by trail bosses was a necessary evil for survival or a breeding ground for tyranny, but few dispute its effectiveness in maintaining order. So, as you ride your flank position, pushing the stragglers, you're always keenly aware of the boss's presence, even if he's miles ahead. His decisions ripple back through the entire crew. You trust him with your life, not because you necessarily like him, but because his judgment is what keeps you and the cattle moving forward towards the railhead. Without a strong, decisive hand at the helm, the entire enterprise would quickly devolve into chaos, a scattering of cattle and men lost to the vast, unforgiving landscape. It's a leadership lesson delivered not in a boardroom, but under a scorching sun with a constant threat of dust and danger. The dust churns underfoot, a constant, gritty cloud as you ride, and you're surrounded by the very essence of the cowboy's purpose, the cattle. Thousands of them, a sea of horns and hides, moaning and lowing, their collective sound a dull roar that becomes the background hum of your existence. You might think, well, they're just cows. How hard can it be to move them? And that, my friend, is where you'd be utterly wrong. Herding cattle isn't like directing sheep. It's a delicate dance of psychology, patience, and brute force when absolutely necessary. These aren't docile dairy cows. These are longhorns, tough, half-wild beasts, bred for survival on the open range. They possess a stubborn independence that would impress even the most recalcitrant teenager, and a flight instinct that can turn into a full-blown stampede in the blink of an eye. Your job, as a line rider, is to keep them moving forward, but also to understand their collective mind. Cattle, surprisingly enough, are creatures of habit. They prefer to follow, to stay together, and to move at a slow, steady pace. Any disruption to this rhythm can trigger panic. So you ride the flanks, constantly nudging the stragglers back into the main body. You learn to anticipate their movements, to read the subtle shifts in their gait or the flick of an ear that might indicate they're about to veer off. It's a constant vigil. You might use your hat, or a shout, or even the crack of a whip not to hit them, but to create a loud, sharp sound that gets their attention. It's a bit like being a very persistent, very tired shepherd, but your sheep weigh 1,000 pounds and have pointy bits. A key historical fact about these drives is the sheer numbers involved. A single large drive could consist of 3,000 to 5,000 head of cattle. Imagine trying to manage that many individual wills, all with their own ideas about which direction is best, usually backwards or towards that patch of fresh grass over there. The whole enterprise moved at a snail's pace, perhaps 10 to 15 miles a day, a slow, methodical crawl designed to keep the cattle from losing too much weight and to prevent them from spooking. It was a marathon, not a sprint. One quirky tidbit: Cowboys discovered that playing music or singing softly, particularly at night, had a remarkably calming effect on the herd. The rhythmic sounds would soothe the cattle, helping to prevent them from becoming restless and attempting to wander off in the darkness. So, picture this: under a vast, star-dusted sky, a cowboy, far from home, humming a tune or singing a melancholic ballad, not for his own entertainment, but to lull thousands of four-legged, stake-on-the-hoof creatures into a peaceful slumber. It's an unexpectedly tender image amidst the rugged reality. Historians still argue whether this practice was primarily for the cattle's benefit or a psychological coping mechanism for the cowboy's loneliness. But either way, it worked. You become intimately familiar with every smell, every sound of the herd. The dusty scent of their hides, the low, guttural grumbles, the rhythmic clack of horns against each other. You learn to recognize individual cattle, even if you spend enough time with them. You see the ones that always try to bolt, the ones that are naturally lazy, the ones that lead. It's a strange, intimate relationship born out of proximity and shared purpose. You're not just moving meat. You're managing a living, breathing, often frustrating but ultimately valuable organism across an indifferent landscape. And when one breaks free, or tries to, you're on them in a flash, cutting them off, turning them back with a combination of skill, speed, and the undeniable presence of your horse. It's a dance you'll repeat hundreds of times before the drive is done. The sun beats down with relentless intensity, baking the earth into a cracked, dusty expanse. Your throat feels like sandpaper, and every breath tastes like grit. This isn't just discomfort. This is the ever-present, terrifying reality of the cattle drive, the desperate, unyielding search for water. Without it, the entire enterprise grinds to a halt, and both man and beast face a slow, agonizing end. Water wasn't something you could just find by pulling out a map app. The trail boss, with his encyclopedic knowledge of the land, would guide the herd towards known watering holes, rivers, or creeks. But even these were often unreliable. Rivers could run dry, or be mere trickles in drought years. Watering holes could be stagnant, muddy pits, barely enough for a few dozen cattle, let alone thousands. And if you missed one, or if it was unexpectedly dry, you faced hours, sometimes days, of desperate searching. Imagine the tension in the air as the herd grows restless, their lowing turning into a mournful, desperate bellow. The cattle, driven by instinct, can smell water from surprisingly far away, and they'll start to break ranks, stampeding towards any hint of moisture. This is when the cowboys work their hardest, riding furiously to keep the thirsty animals together, preventing them from scattering and getting lost, or worse, trampling each other in their frenzy. You learn to conserve every drop of your own water, a precious commodity carried in a canteen slung over your saddle. Every sip is savored, every drop a reminder of your own vulnerability. A mainstream historical fact about these drives is how critical the planning of watering stops was. Before a drive even began, scouts would ride ahead, sometimes for hundreds of miles, to confirm the condition of known water sources and to find new ones. Maps, if they existed, were often crude, and reliable information was passed down through word of mouth, from one seasoned cowboy to another. The success of a drive often hinged on the accuracy of this intel. It was a high-stakes game of environmental prediction, where a wrong guess could decimate your entire herd. Sometimes, desperate measures were called for. If a water source was completely dry, cowboys might resort to digging for water in dry creek beds, hoping to hit the water table. This arduous labor, often under a blistering sun, was a last resort, a testament to the severity of the situation. You might scratch out a shallow depression with shovels, or even your bare hands, waiting for a slow, muddy seep to appear, barely enough to wet the parched throats of a few animals. It's a bit like trying to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool with an eyedropper, but with the added pressure of impending doom. A quirky tidbit from the trail: when water was truly scarce, some cowboys would chew on small pebbles or a piece of leather to stimulate saliva production, a primitive and largely ineffective method to combat the burning thirst. It was more psychological than practical, a way to trick your body into thinking relief was coming. Historians still argue whether the physical toll of dehydration contributed more to cowboy mortality than accidents, but it was certainly a constant threat. The relief when you finally reach a plentiful river or a full watering hole is almost spiritual. The cattle, sensing it, will break into a run, plunging into the water with joyous bellows, drinking deeply, their bodies rehydrating, their tension visibly easing. And you, still on your horse, let your mount drink, then dismount and slake your own thirst, the cool water a blessed balm to your raw throat. In those moments, with the sun setting and the herd finally settled, the relentless thirst fades, replaced by a profound, if brief, sense of accomplishment. But you know, deep down, that the search will begin again tomorrow. The water is a momentary reprieve, but the constant battle against the elements continues its relentless assault. You're not just fighting thirst. You're locked in a perpetual struggle against dust, heat, and broken dreams, the unholy trinity of the open range. Every day brings a new physical challenge, wearing you down, testing the very limits of your endurance. The dust, as you've already felt, is your unwavering companion. It billows up from thousands of hooves propelled by the slightest breeze, coating everything in a fine, gritty layer. It gets into your eyes, making them red-rimmed and itchy. It settles in your hair, turning it stiff and matted. Most insidiously, it fills your nostrils and lungs, causing a persistent cough that rattles your chest, a dry, hacking sound that becomes as common as the creak of your saddle. You learn to breathe through a bandana, a flimsy barrier against the microscopic particles that slowly but surely clog your respiratory system. It's a constant, suffocating presence, a gritty reminder of the miles you're traversing. And then there's the heat. The sun, a merciless orb in the vast, cloudless sky, beats down with an intensity that seems to leach the very moisture from your body. Sweat drips down your face, stinging your eyes, soaking your clothes. The leather of your saddle becomes hot to the touch, and your skin, exposed to the relentless UV rays, turns a leathery brown, often cracked and peeling despite your best efforts. Heat stroke is a very real danger, not just for the men, but for the cattle as well. You learn to recognize the subtle signs. Lethargy, a glazed look in the eyes, the desperate search for any sliver of shade, however meager. Cowboys would sometimes douse their hats in water, if they had any despair, for a brief, fleeting moment of relief, or simply ride with their shirts off, trading sunburn for a slight breeze. It's a bit like trying to enjoy a sauna while simultaneously running a marathon, utterly exhausting and surprisingly uncomfortable. A mainstream historical fact is that many cowboys suffered from long-term respiratory issues and skin damage due to this constant exposure. While the immediate dangers of stampedes and outlaws were more dramatic, the slow, grinding toll of the environment was perhaps the more insidious killer. They didn't have sunscreen or modern medicine. Their bodies simply had to adapt or break. But it's not just the heat and dust. The weather on the plains is notoriously fickle. One moment, it's a baking hot day. The next, a sudden, violent thunderstorm can erupt, turning the dusty trail into a slick, treacherous quagmire. Rain, when it comes, can be a blessing for thirst, but a misery for morale. Your clothes, your bedroll, everything gets soaked, and staying warm in the damp chill becomes a new challenge. Lightning, too, is a constant threat, striking the tall figures of men and horses on the exposed plains. And then there are the sudden, ferocious winds, whipping up dust devils that can disorient both man and beast, or even tear apart a poorly secured camp. A quirky tidbit: some cowboys would collect the dew that settled on their bedrolls in the morning, wringing out the damp fabric into a cup for a few precious drops of cool, albeit slightly dusty, water. It was a testament to how every potential source of hydration was considered, no matter how small or unconventional. Historians still argue whether these environmental hardships strengthened the cowboys' resolve or simply broke them down, but undoubtedly, they shaped the very essence of the cowboy spirit. You learn to take the good with the bad, to appreciate the momentary shade of a lone mesquite tree, or the fleeting scent of rain on dry earth, because you know, deep down, that the harsh realities will always return. After battling the relentless elements all day, your stomach begins to rumble, a low, insistent complaint that drowns out even the constant lowing of the herd. You fantasize about a hot meal, perhaps something with actual vegetables, maybe even a dessert. Then you remember where you are. Welcome to Trail Grub, a culinary nightmare designed less for pleasure and more for sheer, brutal sustenance. The staple of the cowboy diet was unequivocally beans. Not just any beans, mind you, but often pinto beans, cooked in a Dutch oven over an open fire until they were soft, mushy, and largely flavorless, save for the occasional bit of bacon fat. You ate them for breakfast, often cold. You ate them for lunch, if you were lucky enough to stop. And you certainly ate them for dinner. If there was a culinary god, he was definitely on vacation during the cattle drive era. It's a bit like being trapped in a bean-themed escape room, where the only way out is to eat more beans. Alongside the beans, you had coffee. Lots of it. Strong, black, and often gritty with grounds. It was brewed in a large, perpetually blackened pot over the campfire. This wasn't for leisure. It was pure, unadulterated caffeine delivery, a jolt of energy to cut through the exhaustion and keep you alert for your long shifts. Some might call it rocket fuel. Others might call it liquid dirt, but either way, it was indispensable. Meat, surprisingly, wasn't always readily available despite being surrounded by thousands of potential steaks. The cattle being driven were property, meant for sale, not for consumption unless absolutely necessary. If an animal was injured beyond recovery or died naturally and wasn't diseased, then you might get fresh beef, a rare and celebrated treat. Otherwise, it was usually salt pork or dry jerky, tough and chewy, designed for preservation rather than palatability. Imagine trying to gnaw your way through a piece of leather, and you're getting close to the experience. A mainstream historical fact: the typical cowboy's diet was severely lacking in fresh fruits and vegetables, leading to widespread issues like scurvy if drives lasted long enough. They simply didn't have the means to carry and preserve fresh produce across hundreds of miles of unforgiving terrain. Their bodies, accustomed to hard labor, adapted to survive on this nutrient-sparse fare, but it was far from ideal for long-term health. The cooking itself was rudimentary. There were no fancy stoves or refrigeration. Everything was cooked over an open fire, often in cast iron pots and pans that absorbed the smoke and char of countless meals. Flavor came from whatever was available: salt, perhaps a bit of wild onion if you were lucky enough to spot one. Spices were a luxury unheard of. Every meal was a utilitarian exercise, designed to provide calories and stave off hunger, not to delight the palate. A quirky tidbit is the legend of sourdough, not just the bread, but the sourdough starter itself, which was often a prized possession of the chuck wagon cook. This living, bubbling concoction was used to make biscuits or flapjacks, providing a slight tang and a bit of leavening. Some cooks would even sleep with their starter in a warm bedroll to keep it alive in cold weather, treating it with a reverence usually reserved for family heirlooms. Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits of sourdough were real or simply a psychological boost, but its omnipresence on the trail is undeniable. You learn to appreciate the simplest things: a hot cup of coffee, a warm biscuit, anything that isn't another serving of beans. The sheer monotony of the food eventually dulls your senses, leaving you with a profound appreciation for even a slight variation in texture or taste. You eat to live, not the other way around. While you're busy contemplating the endless variations of beans, someone else is making sure those variations, however slight, actually materialize. That unsung hero, often working in the background but absolutely critical to the survival and morale of the entire drive, is the chuck wagon cook. He's more than just a chef. He's a quartermaster, a medic, a confidant, and sometimes the only source of comfort in an otherwise brutally hard existence. The chuck wagon itself was a marvel of frontier engineering, essentially a mobile kitchen on wheels. Invented by Charles Goodnight in 1866, it was a heavy-duty wagon, often repurposed for military surplus, with a chuck box at the rear that folded down to create a workbench. This box contained compartments for utensils, dry goods, and all the culinary necessities. Underneath, barrels held water, and a coffee pot was almost perpetually brewing over a bed of coals. It was designed to be rugged, capable of traversing rough terrain, and efficient, holding everything the cook needed to feed a hungry crew, often in adverse conditions. Think of it as the original food truck, but significantly less glamorous and far more essential. The cook's day started even earlier than yours, often before 3 a.m. He had to get the fire going, brew the coffee, and prepare breakfast for the hungry cowboys who would soon be stirring. While you were out on the range, he was busy breaking down camp, packing up the wagon, and driving it ahead to the next designated camp spot, often miles away, to get dinner started. He was the only one who didn't have a specific riding duty with the cattle, but his labor was just as constant and physically demanding. He lifted heavy sacks of flour, managed boiling pots over open flames, and kept his precious sourdough starter alive, come hell or high water. A mainstream historical fact: the chuck wagon cook was often one of the highest paid members of the crew, second only to the trail boss. This wasn't because of his gourmet cooking skills, but because of his indispensable role. A good cook could make or break the morale of the crew, and a bad one could lead to grumbling, sickness, and even desertion. He was the glue that held the human element of the drive together. Beyond the cooking, the chuck wagon cook often served as the camp's informal doctor, dispensing remedies for minor injuries, snake bites, or the pervasive coughs from dust. He was also often the barber, the mail carrier, if mail could even reach them, and the one who held onto the crew's money for safekeeping, especially once they neared trails' end and the temptations of town. He was, in essence, the camp's central hub, a kind of grizzled, all-knowing den mother for a band of dusty, exhausted men. A quirky tidbit: the cook's call to meals was often a unique sound, perhaps a banging on a skillet or a distinct holler. Cowboys, even miles away, learned to recognize this signal, a promise of a temporary respite and a hot, or at least warm meal. It was a beacon, cutting through the monotony and reminding them that another day was nearing its end. Historians still argue whether the cook's true value lay more in his culinary contributions or his role as a psychological anchor for the crew, but his central presence in countless cowboy narratives speaks volumes. You rely on him not just for food, but for the rhythm he brings to the otherwise chaotic and unpredictable life on the trail. His wagon, and the aroma emanating from it, becomes a familiar, comforting landmark in the vast, featureless landscape. You're still riding, the sun now a fading ember in the west, casting long, distorted shadows across the plains. As darkness descends, a new kind of tension settles over the drive, a silent awareness of dangers that lurk beyond the visible horizon. You've heard the stories, the whispered tales around countless campfires, and you know that the greatest threat beyond nature's fury often comes from other men. This is the world of bandits and border justice. The open range, vast and sparsely populated, was a perfect hunting ground for those with ill intent. Rustlers, highwaymen, and opportunistic gangs saw the massive cattle drives as an easy target, a moving vault of valuable livestock ripe for the taking. These weren't always the dashing, honorable outlaws of dime novels. More often, they were desperate, ruthless individuals willing to resort to violence for a quick score. You learn to ride with one hand instinctively near your pistol, to scan the distant ridges not just for stray cattle, but for the telltale dust cloud of approaching riders. A mainstream historical fact, organized cattle rustling became a significant problem during the peak of the cattle drive era, particularly in Texas and along the various trails leading north. Gangs would sometimes try to stampede a portion of the herd away, or simply drive off a small number of cattle under the cover of night. The sheer scale of the drives made it impossible to guard every single animal, making them vulnerable. It was a constant game of cat and mouse, where vigilance was the only real defense. The consequences of being caught by these bandits were often dire. Losing cattle meant significant financial losses for the owners, and for the Cowboys, it meant their pay might be docked or their reputation sullied. But beyond economics, there was the very real threat to life and limb. A confrontation could quickly escalate into a shootout, a chaotic, deadly exchange of gunfire under the stars, far from any semblance of law and order. And that brings us to the concept of border justice, or more accurately, frontier justice. There were no formal police forces out on the open range, no courts to appeal to, and certainly no time for lengthy trials. If rustlers were caught in the act, or if their guilt was beyond reasonable doubt, the Cowboys themselves, led by the trail boss, often administered immediate, brutal justice. This could range from severe beating to, in the most extreme cases, hanging. It was swift, uncompromising, and designed to send a clear message to anyone else considering a similar venture. It wasn't always pretty, but it was effective in a world where survival depended on deterrence. It's like a Wild West version of instant karma, delivered with a rope. A quirky tidbit: some trail bosses employed shouldists or regulators, men specifically hired for their gunfighting skills to deter or confront rustlers. These individuals weren't necessarily cowboys in the traditional sense, but highly skilled gunmen who served as a mobile security force. Their presence, often communicated through whispered rumors, was sometimes enough to make potential bandits think twice. Historians still argue whether this vigilante justice was a necessary evil to maintain order in lawless lands or simply a perpetuation of violence. But what's undeniable is that it was the only system available. So, as you take your turn on night watch, riding slowly around the bedded down cattle, your senses are heightened. Every rustle of leaves, every distant coyote howl, every shadow takes on a new significance. You listen, you watch, and you're prepared to act because out here, your survival and the success of the drive depends on your ability to protect what's yours. The lowing of the cattle, usually a comforting, rhythmic drone, suddenly changes pitch. It's not just a grumble now. It's a rising chorus of panicked bellows, a raw, primal sound that sends a chill down your spine. This isn't just cattle moving. This is the terrifying, explosive chaos of a stampede. Nature's fury unleashed, and you're directly in its path. A stampede could be triggered by anything: a sudden clap of thunder, a startled rabbit bolting through the herd, a coyote howling too close, or even just a nervous steer taking off in the darkness. Once one animal spooks, the fear is contagious, spreading like wildfire through thousands of others. The ground begins to tremble, a low rumble quickly escalating into a thunderous roar as hooves pound the earth. Imagine standing at the end of a runway as a dozen jet planes take off simultaneously. But those jets are made of muscle and bone, weigh a ton each, and are headed directly for you. Your first instinct might be to panic, but there's no time for that. Survival depends on immediate, decisive action. You spur your horse, urging it to its fastest gallop, riding hard to get to the head of the stampeding herd. The goal isn't to stop them outright, that's impossible, but to mill them. This involves riding alongside the lead cattle, slowly, painstakingly, turning them in a wide, ever-tightening circle. It's a bit like trying to herd a runaway freight train into a circular track, hoping it eventually runs out of momentum. This maneuver requires incredible horsemanship, nerves of steel, and an uncanny understanding of the herd psychology. A mainstream historical fact is that stampedes were responsible for significant losses of cattle and, tragically, many cowboy lives. Once cattle started running, they could cover miles, sometimes falling over cliffs, drowning in rivers, or simply becoming scattered across vast distances, making recovery an arduous, often futile, task. The economic impact alone was devastating, let alone the human cost. The dust, already a nuisance, becomes an impenetrable, choking cloud during a stampede. You can barely see your hand in front of your face, relying on the sound of pounding hooves and the vague shapes of bodies to guide you. The danger isn't just being trampled. It's also the risk of your horse stumbling in a prairie dog hole or hitting a hidden rock, sending you sprawling directly into the path of thousands of tons of panicked beef. The air is thick with the smell of fear, sweat, and churned earth. A quirky tidbit. During night stampedes, cowboys would sometimes use their voices, yelling and singing loudly, to try and direct the herd. The theory was that a consistent sound, even if loud, was less frightening than erratic noises and could subtly influence the direction of the lead cattle. It's an almost surreal image. Men risking their lives in a maelstrom of fear, singing folk songs to an audience of terrified cows. Historians still argue whether the singing genuinely influenced the cattle or simply helped the cowboys maintain their sanity. But it was a widely practiced technique. You ride, your heart pounding, your muscles screaming, until slowly, gradually the thundering roar begins to lessen. The circle tightens, and the heaving, exhausted mass of cattle finally slows, then settles into a heaving, exhausted stillness. The relief is palpable, a heavy weight lifting from your chest, but the work isn't over. Now comes the arduous task of gathering the scattered animals, often riding for days to find every last straggler. The dust settles, the cattle are slowly being gathered, but the dangers of the trail extend far beyond stampedes and bandits. In this unforgiving environment, where distances are vast and help is hours or even days away, even a minor injury can become a life-threatening crisis. Welcome to the grim reality of frontier medicine. Aches and agonies where resilience was your best doctor and hope your only medicine. Imagine this. You're thrown from your horse, perhaps tangled in your lariat, and you land awkwardly. A broken bone, or maybe you've been kicked by a nervous steer. Or, even more subtly, a deep cut from a thorny bush becomes infected in the dust and sweat. There are no emergency rooms out here, no ambulances, no sterile operating theaters. Your medical kit is likely limited to a few rolls of bandages, some crude disinfectant like whiskey, more for the pain than the antisepsis, let's be honest, and perhaps some dubious herbal concoctions passed down through generations. It's less a medical bag and more a collection of desperate prayers. A mainstream historical fact. Infections were a leading cause of death on the cattle trails. A simple cut, if left untreated or improperly cared for, could quickly turn gangrenous, leading to amputation or a slow, agonizing demise. Sickness, too, was rampant. Dysentery from contaminated water was common, as were various fevers. The lack of hygiene, the close quarters, and the constant exposure to the elements created a breeding ground for ailments that modern medicine dismisses with a shrug. The cook, as you remember, might have some rudimentary knowledge, or the trail boss might possess a bit of folk wisdom, but true medical expertise was almost non-existent. Painkillers were unheard of beyond the numbing effect of alcohol. Setting a broken bone was a brutal affair, often done by a fellow cowboy with brute strength and a guess, splinted with whatever wood was at hand. If you were truly incapacitated, your options were grim. Hope to reach a distant settlement, or be left behind, a tragic but sometimes necessary decision in a world that prioritized the herd's movement. It's like being in a game of Operation, but instead of buzzing, you're just, well, suffering. A quirky tidbit: some cowboys swore by poultices made from chewing tobacco and spit for treating snake bites or infected wounds, believing the nicotine had some antiseptic properties. While certainly not medically sound, it was a desperate attempt to combat overwhelming odds with whatever was at hand. Historians still argue whether the physical toughness of cowboys was a result of enduring such pain, or if only the toughest survived long enough to become cowboys. Regardless, the constant threat of injury and disease added another layer of silent dread to every mile. You learn to live with pain, to ignore the constant aches and stiffness. A limp, a sore shoulder, a persistent cough, these become part of your normal state of being. You push through, knowing that there's no one else to take your place, and the herd won't wait. You pray for minor ailments, for scrapes and bruises that heal on their own, because anything more serious could spell the end of your time on the trail, or worse, the end of you. Every day you wake up relatively sound. You consider it a small victory against the vast, indifferent forces of the wilderness. You've endured the dust, the thirst, the questionable food, and the constant threat of injury. Weeks, sometimes months, have blurred into a monotonous cycle of riding, eating, and sleeping under the stars. But then a change in the air, a subtle shift in the landscape, brings a new surge of energy through the weary crew. The distant, shimmering haze on the horizon isn't just heat. It's the promise of civilization. You're nearing the railhead, the point where the cattle will be sold, and your arduous journey will finally conclude. Welcome to Beyond the Trail, Town Temptations. The anticipation is almost as potent as the fear of stampede. For weeks, your world has been defined by the herd, the open range, and the faces of the few men who share your misery. Now, the thought of a rail bed, a hot bath, a meal cooked by someone else, anyone else, and perhaps a glass of something stronger than coffee fills your thoughts. The subtle scent of wood smoke gives way to something new. The faint, exciting smell of a settlement. A mainstream historical fact: these trail towns like Abilene, Dodge City, or Ogallala exploded in size and reputation precisely because of the cattle drives. They were raw, booming centers of commerce and revelry, built to service the influx of cattle and cowboys. These towns were a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of the plains, offering every vice and luxury a cowboy, flush with months of pay, could desire. Imagine stepping out of a time machine from the Stone Age directly into Las Vegas. It was that kind of sensory overload. But with temptation came peril. Cowboys, having saved up their wages for months, often blew their entire earnings in a matter of days. Saloons, gambling halls, and brothels flourished, eager to relieve these hard-working men of their cash. Fights were common, fueled by alcohol and pent-up aggression. A peaceful evening could quickly devolve into a chaotic brawl, or worse, a deadly shootout. The wild and Wild West was largely concentrated in these boom towns, where a mix of exhausted, exhilarated men, loose cash, and little law enforcement often proved a volatile combination. It's like the moment after a super intense final exam, when all your discipline just evaporates, but with more whiskey and less studying. Your senses, dulled by weeks of sameness, are now assaulted. The cacophony of voices, the clinking of glasses, the distant sound of a piano from a saloon, the unfamiliar scent of cooking food and perfume. It's overwhelming, exhilarating, and dangerous. You watch your step, keeping an eye on your fellow cowboys. knowing that good intentions can disappear faster than a tumbleweed in a tornado. A quirky tidbit: many cowboys, despite their rough exterior, were meticulously clean-shaven once they hit town. After weeks of beard growth and dust, a fresh shave and a haircut were often among the first orders of business, a symbolic shedding of the trail's grime and a step back toward civilization. Historians still argue whether the transition from the isolation of the trail to the chaos of the town led to more psychological distress than physical harm. But the stark contrast was undeniable. You might finally get that bath, scrub off weeks of grit, and for a fleeting moment, feel like a new man. But the pull of the saloons, the dice, and the dance hall girls is strong, a siren song after months of deprivation. You know deep down that you've earned this, but you also know it could cost you everything you just worked so hard for. You've seen the wild, unbridled chaos of the boomtowns, the temptations that threaten to unravel months of hard-earned discipline. But before that inevitable collision with civilization, back on the trail, amidst the endless plains and the constant dangers, there was another, softer side to cowboy life, a surprising balm against the crushing monotony and loneliness. This was the world of the Cowboys' lonely lullabies, where music and storytelling bridged the vast distances between men. Imagine the end of a long, grueling day. The cattle are bedded down, a few night riders keeping watch, their silhouettes barely visible against the star-dusted sky. The campfire, a flickering beacon in the vast darkness, casts dancing shadows on the faces of your fellow cowboys. The chuck wagon cook is cleaning up, the scent of coffee still lingering in the cool night air. This is when the quiet moments emerged, moments when men, otherwise hardened by the trail, would turn to simple forms of entertainment. A mainstream historical fact: music played an incredibly important role in cowboy culture. Lacking any other form of mass media, cowboys relied on their own voices and simple instruments like guitars, banjos, or harmonicas to pass the time and express themselves. Songs were often about their experiences, the loneliness of the range, the dangers of stampedes, the love for their horses, or the longing for home. These weren't polished, professional performances. They were raw, heartfelt expressions, often sung in unison, creating a sense of camaraderie and shared experience. It was like a very low-tech, live-streamed open mic night, but with actual stakes. Storytelling, too, was a vital part of trail life. Around the flickering fire, men would spin tales, exaggerated accounts of their daring exploits, humorous anecdotes about their horses, or tall tales that stretched the boundaries of believability. These stories served multiple purposes. They entertained, they taught lessons, and they helped new hands understand the unwritten rules and legends of the trail. The act of sharing these narratives fostered a deep sense of connection, transforming a disparate group of individuals into a cohesive, albeit temporary, family. A quirky tidbit: some cowboys believe that singing to the cattle at night not only calmed the herd, but also helped them stay awake and alert during their long, solitary watches. The rhythmic sound of their own voices, a human presence amidst the vast, silent plains, acted as a kind of self-hypnosis, warding off sleep and the creeping dread of loneliness. Historians still argue whether the primary function of cowboy songs was practical, calming cattle, or psychological, comforting cowboys, but their pervasive influence on the culture is clear. These moments of shared song and story were precious. They were a break from the constant vigilance, the aching muscles, and the relentless march. They allowed a glimpse into the inner lives of these men, revealing vulnerability and a surprising depth of spirit beneath the hardened exterior. You might hear a sad ballad about a cowboy who never made it home, or a raucous ditty about a mischievous horse. Whatever the tune or tale, it filled the empty spaces of the night, creating a bond that transcended words. It was in these quiet hours that the myth of the cowboy was truly forged, not in grand battles, but in the simple, shared humanity of men facing down a vast, indifferent world together. You listen, sometimes joining in, sometimes just soaking it all in, and for a little while the loneliness of the trail fades into the background hum of a distant melody. You've traversed the dusty plains, endured the brutal sun, outrun stampedes, and perhaps even dodged a bandit or two. You've tasted the bland reality of trail grub and found solace in a shared song around a flickering fire. As you look back on this grueling journey, it becomes clear that the cowboy era, though relatively brief in the grand sweep of history, left an indelible mark. This is the legacy of the leather and lore, the enduring myth and reality of the American cowboy. The cattle drives, a mainstream historical fact, fundamentally reshaped the American West. They helped build the ranching industry, populated vast territories, and laid the groundwork for future economic development. Millions of cattle were moved from the vast Texas ranges to the railheads in Kansas, feeding a hungry nation and a burgeoning European market. This wasn't just a job. It was an economic engine, driving expansion and creating a new kind of American hero. The leather of their saddles, their chaps, their gloves, every piece of gear became a symbol of this unique, hard-won existence. But beyond the economics, the cowboy captured the American imagination like few other figures. The image of the rugged individual, self-reliant and free, riding across an endless horizon, became a powerful symbol of independence and frontier spirit. This myth, romanticized and exaggerated over time, permeated popular culture, from dime novels to Wild West shows, and later to Hollywood movies and television. You see echoes of it today in fashion, music, and our collective idea of what it means to be truly American. It's a bit like how superheroes are revered today, but with more dirt and fewer capes. Yet, this romanticized version often glossed over the harsh realities you've experienced. It seldom highlighted the endless monotony, the brutal working conditions, the severe lack of comfort, or the constant threat of injury and disease. The real cowboy was less a dashing hero and more a tenacious laborer, driven by necessity and a profound understanding of his environment. Historians still argue whether the romanticized myth helped or hindered a true understanding of the historical cowboy, but its power is undeniable. A quirky tidbit that often surprises people is the diverse ethnic and racial makeup of cowboy crews. While popular culture often depicts cowboys as exclusively white, a significant portion estimates range from 15% to 25%, or even higher were African American, Mexican, and Native American. These individuals, often facing discrimination elsewhere, found opportunities and a degree of equality on the trail where skill and endurance mattered more than skin color. Their contributions, though often overlooked in early narratives, were absolutely vital to the success of the cattle drives. Remember that sense of camaraderie you felt around the campfire? It often transcended the societal prejudices of the time. The lore, the stories, the songs, these formed the backbone of the cowboy legend, passed down through generations. They captured the spirit of the open range, the freedom, the danger, the resilience. They gave voice to the solitary nature of the work, the longing for home, and the deep, unspoken bond between men who faced death together every day. You can still hear echoes of those lullabies in country music, still see the glint of that independent spirit in our cultural identity. The cowboy, in essence, became a metaphor for facing down vast, untamed challenges with grit and determination, a narrative deeply embedded in the fabric of the nation. You've seen the cowboy's enduring impact, the way his image still gallops through our collective imagination. But like all grand chapters of history, the era of the open-range cattle drive, the one you've just experienced, was destined to fade. You can feel it now, a subtle shift in the air, a sense of an ending. This is the story of the fading echoes of the West, and the transformation of the cowboy myth. The forces that brought the cattle drives into being, the vast open lands, the demand for beef, the ingenuity of men on horseback, were ultimately the same forces that led to their demise. The relentless westward expansion, a mainstream historical fact, brought settlers, barbed wire, and railroads. Barbed wire, in particular, was the death knell for the open range. Invented in the 1870s, it allowed farmers and ranchers to cheaply and effectively fence off their land, preventing cattle from trampling crops or grazing freely. Suddenly, the endless, unfenced trails became a patchwork of private property, making long-distance drives increasingly difficult, if not impossible. Imagine trying to drive thousands of cattle through a giant, intricate maze of fences. It just wouldn't work. The railroads, too, evolved. As rail lines pushed further west and south, they eventually reached deeper into cattle country, closer to the source of the herds. This meant that cattle no longer needed to be driven hundreds or thousands of miles to distant railheads. They could be loaded onto trains much closer to their ranches, significantly reducing the need for massive, long-distance drives. The Cowboys' job changed from a long-distance drover to a ranch hand, focusing more on breeding, branding, and caring for cattle within fenced pastures. The romance of the open trail gave way to the practicality of modern ranching. A quirky tidbit: the last great cattle drive of the open range era is often cited as occurring around the late 1880s, marking a surprisingly swift end to a period that felt so vast and timeless. The transition was so rapid that many cowboys who had known nothing but the trail suddenly found themselves having to adapt to new forms of work or move on to other frontiers that were quickly disappearing. Historians still argue whether the invention of barbed wire or the expansion of the railroads had the greater impact on ending the open range, but both undeniably contributed to its swift demise. The wild, boisterous trail towns that thrived on the cowboy economy also began to change. Many settled down, becoming more conventional agricultural centers, while others, like Dodge City, found new identities beyond the cattle trade. The raw, untamed frontier was slowly, inexorably being tamed. Law and order, though still rough around the edges, became more established, and the need for immediate frontier justice lessened. You can almost hear the fading echoes now. The distant, less frequent lowing of a smaller herd. The whisper of wind through barbed wire fences where once there was open prairie. The cowboy, as you've come to know him, didn't vanish entirely, of course. He adapted, evolving into the modern rancher and rodeo star, a custodian of a proud heritage. But the specific breed of cowboy who endured rotten food, escaped stampedes, and fought off bandits on epic cattle drives, that particular chapter closed. The vast, untamed freedom, the brutal simplicity of life on the trail, these became memories, enshrined in song and story, shaping a powerful myth that continues to resonate, long after the last great drive faded into the dust. The sun is truly setting now, painting the sky in soft, muted tones of lavender and gray. The wind whispers through the tall grasses, a gentle sigh across the vast, empty plains. The distant sound of a coyote's mournful howl seems to carry all the quiet stories of the past, stories of hardship and resilience, of endless miles and fleeting moments of camaraderie. You can let the images of the dusty trail, the lowing cattle, and the campfire's glow slowly soften around the edges. Your own breath grows steady and deep, a calming rhythm. The ache in your phantom saddle sores begins to ease, and the grit of the trail slowly washes away, replaced by the soft comfort of your bed. The cowboys, their work done, are now drifting into their own hard-earned sleep, their dreams perhaps filled with wide-open spaces and the quiet dignity of a day well lived. Let those thoughts accompany you now, a gentle, soothing presence,